the Bible has numerous places where it actually describes women as having authority, not just some authority, but divinely appointed authority. In other words, men didn't give the authority to women. God gave the authority to women. Hey friends, it's Abdu Murray. Welcome to All Rise. As you know, this is a podcast where, using my legal training, we take a look at objections against and claims in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective, and we'll try to employ rules of evidence and trial procedure and that kind of stuff to see if the objections or the claims in favor of the Christian faith actually hold water. Well, today we're going to tackle an interesting topic. We're going to talk about women in the Bible, and we're going to be responding to an objection that the Bible has some rather ridiculous verses, according to the skeptic, on women and other things as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to feature a short clip of a 10-minute video, and as we always do, by the way, we're going to have the link to the full video so you can watch it in its full context in the show notes and in the description. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. But if you're listening on podcast, you'll be able to see it also in the show notes as well. So you can go have a listen to the full thing yourself. So this clip will come from Secular Talk. It's a show on YouTube. It's got quite a following, actually. He's got 900, and I think at the last check, 990,000 subscribers, so almost a million. My guess is that given that level, probably by the time you see this, it'll have 1 million subscribers. And it's called Secular Talk, and it's hosted by a guy named Kyle Kulinski. And Kyle Kulinski's style, and you'll see it, he's over the top. And that doesn't mean that we can't intellectually, honestly engage with his rhetoric and his material. That's because he's got a style that might come off as abrasive to Christians doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage with it. In fact, it actually means we should engage with it with grace and truth at the same time. And he's also quite popular among skeptical people and secular people and atheists as well. So let's give a listen to Kyle Kulinski as he talks about ridiculous verses in the Bible you've never heard. Here's a short clip, and we'll come back after we hear from him.
And these are things that I didn't know. These are other absurd Bible verses that were totally foreign to me. I had no idea they existed until I read this, and they are delicious. So let me read you some of these, and please feel free to use them when you're debating a bunch of idiots, okay? Quote, "I permit no woman to teach or have authority over men. She is to keep silent." That's in Timothy 2:11. And the takeaway from this, of course, is the whole idea of having female teachers in school, it's against the Bible. Fire them all. And you're not allowed, don't ever listen to a woman. That's what it's saying. No woman should have authority over men. So you know what else that means? All female doctors, all female surgeons. Sorry, you're fired. It's in the Bible. Never have a female teacher, never have a female doctor.
All right. So we'll stop there for a moment. We'll come back in a little bit. So Kyle's channel, as you can see, he is an incendiary guy. He apparently calls anybody who wants to take the Bible seriously as a matter of a guidance for their faith and practice, he calls them idiots, and calls these verses, these objectionable verses, at least in his mind, quote unquote, delicious. So let's talk this through, because as you can see, his interpretation of them, he reads them out loud. He reads one out loud specifically in this particular clip, and he goes into other things as well. So I don't want to necessarily hold him to this one clip. But what he does is essentially apply it in a way that is very, very general, saying, for example, you can't have women teachers, you can't have women doctors, because women can't have any role of authority over a man. He's trying to give this the least charitable reading as humanly possible. Now, Kyle has a lot of stuff out there on the internet. As I said before, he's got 990,000 subscribers. This particular video has 588,000 views, so almost 600,000 people have watched it. And it's got, at last count, as far as me recording this particular episode, he has 14,000 likes on this video. So it's quite popular. But is it actually correct? So is it long on rhetoric but short on substance? Well, we'll find out in a minute. But before we do that, let me just pause for a moment and encourage you to not only subscribe to our YouTube channel, we need some subscribers as well, but also make sure you click the notifications button so that it's the bell, so that you're notified whenever a new video comes up. And that's important for a couple of reasons, friends. One, obviously, the more subscribers, the more the content gets pushed out, and we can actually respond with greater impact and a wider impact than we ordinarily would. But two, when you hit the notification button, you'll be notified of something really important. And as you might already know, but if you don't, here's some news for you. We have a new show that comes out 1 week after this one called Deliberations. So by the time you're watching this on a Monday, in the following week, 8 days later on a Tuesday, Derek Caldwell and I will join you all, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, for Deliberations. Deliberations is a live show, actually. So what we'll do is we'll interact with you on this particular episode, whether you see it on YouTube or you see it on Spotify or listen to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. We love to hear from you. So you can send in questions either ahead of time or even during the show and it'll be on our YouTube channel. So when you click the notification button after you subscribe, you'll be notified, hey, we're going live. And by the way, if you follow us on social media, if you follow us on Instagram, which is Abdu Murray 12, and you follow me on Facebook, you'll be notified that we're going live as well on those platforms. So you can send in questions on those platforms as well. So multiple ways for you to interact with us on this material. So after each episode of All Rise, you'll have a chance, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to deliberate with us and ask further questions, because we can't get to everything in these episodes. We just can't. They'd be hours and hours long. So join us for Deliberations. So again, subscribe and click the notification button. And if you follow us on social media, you'll automatically be notified when we go live. Now, times vary, by the way. We will typically be in about the middle of the day on the following Tuesday. Times will vary depending on my travel schedule, but usually we're trying to do it right around the middle of the day. But you won't have to worry about that because it'll be a notification you receive when you subscribe. So back to the show. Let's add some other things, by the way, to make the objections that Kyle launches a little more difficult. Because frankly, this particular video and some of the other videos that Kyle has are popular level stuff. That doesn't mean they're illegitimate. They're just popular level stuff. So they're a little more easy to respond to. There are some actual objections against the Christian faith that go beyond Kyle, and you've probably already heard many of these things. So let me read to you a couple of things from an article that was published in the Huffington Post in 2012. The article was entitled, and again, we'll have the link, The Marginalization of Women, a Biblical Value We Don't Like to Talk About. Now, the author was Christopher Ralston, and he's a contributor to the Huffington Post, and he is an actual legitimate scholar, a religion scholar at George Washington University. He's a professor. He's a lecturer there. He holds an MA and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, so that's no slouch. And he is a widely published scholar on ancient Near East, in other words, the Middle East, especially the Bible and the Quran. So that's interesting all by itself. So it looks like he's also teaching, I think, currently now at Columbian College of Arts and Sciences in D.C., so he's got quite a bit of bona fides as well. So this is what he says in his article. He says, the New Testament contains texts that marginalize women as well. I think he's referring to also the Old Testament. Among the harshest of these texts is 1 Timothy 2, which is what Kyle actually quoted from. Kyle said Timothy, but there is no Timothy. There's 1 and 2 Timothy, but this article correctly points it out that the correct citation is 1 Timothy 2. And he says the author, in this case, I think it's Paul, but the author is discussing worship and begins by stating that men should pray and then says women should dress themselves modestly and decently. So, in other words, men are to pray and women are to dress modestly. Now, that's quite a contrast, but there's more. Let a woman learn in silence and full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to be silent. Now, the rationale here is that for Adam was, and he goes on to say that the author, or Paul's rationale for saying a woman should be silent, is because Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 to 14. So according to this text, as Dr. Ralston goes on, he says, women were to be silent in worship because they were created second and sinned first. And then the final blow is this: a woman will be saved through childbirth if she remains in faith and love and sanctification with modesty, 1 Timothy 2:15. He goes on to say, this text is not too different from a saying in the Gospel of Thomas, which is not really an issue for us, By the way, I want to pause for a moment there because the Gospel of Thomas is not an authentic gospel. It's second century, late second century kind of stuff, mid-second century kind of stuff that actually isn't authentic, doesn't go to the early church, and wasn't considered authoritative in any way. But for whatever reason, he wants to bring it up. And he says that the Gospel of Thomas says that women can be saved once they become males. That's not actually the same thing at all, by the way. He says this text in 1 Timothy 2:15 about women becoming saved through childbearing and all these things is not too different from a saying that women can be saved once they become males. Well, that's completely different. That's not even close to the same thing. So that's not necessarily the point of our discussion here, but it is a point worth making because I think that's a little fast and loose with the words, this is not too different. It's worlds different. In any case, he goes on to say, for the author of 1 Timothy, and I think it's Paul, but apparently he doesn't, eternal salvation comes obstetrically. That's his main point. And I don't think that actually is the main point here if you consider those two things together. Now, there are even more difficult texts. Let's make the case even harder because I think it's important as Christians, and I want to pause for a moment here. And you've heard me say this before. I think it's important for Christians not to respond to the flimsiest version of an argument that a skeptic might have, or to the flimsiest version of a doubt a skeptic might have. Because if you do that, if you respond to the straw man, as it were, what ends up happening is it looks like you knocked over a real man, but you've only knocked over a straw man. So when the real thing does finally come, and let's say a skeptic comes to faith or has that objection answered, and what you've done is knock down a straw man version of that objection, and then someone comes and brings the real man, maybe an armored man version of an objection, and that skeptic suddenly feels like they were cheated or lied to the first time. Will they come to faith? Or if they did come to faith, will that faith be shaken to its core? So we have to responsibly answer, as far as we're able, the hardest version of an argument against the Christian faith, not the weakest version. So that's why I chose to use not only Kyle's video from Secular Talk, but also the Huffington Post article. And there's many others. So let's make it even more difficult because it's not just 1 Timothy chapter 2 that we have to deal with. Of course, we have to deal with Paul's other statements in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. But there's more to this whole thing. So let's look. For example, Genesis says that the patriarch Lot was willing to force his two daughters out the door to be raped. And the book of Judges says that a Levite actually did force his concubines out the door to be gang raped. And after she died, he cut her corpse into 12 pieces and all these things. By the way, none of these things are condoned. This is an important part of this. None of those actions in Genesis 34 with Lot and then Judges chapter 19 to 21, none of those things are actually condoned. They're just described in the Bible. The first thing you got to notice when you look at these obviously disturbing descriptions is Genesis 34 and Judges 19 to 21 prescribing something? Is the Bible prescribing it? In other words, is it being ordered by God or in some way being condoned by God or approved by God? Or is this action merely being described by God? In other words, when Lot offers his daughters, first of all, is he really offering his daughters to be raped because he doesn't care about them? Or is there more to it than that? And even if he is that just being described? In other words, it's something that Lot did, but it isn't necessarily something that God condones. And then in Judges, when the Levite actually forces a concubine out the door to be gang raped, and then cuts her corpse into pieces, is that being described, merely saying this is what happened, or is it being prescribed? This is what should have happened. So that's the first thing you have to ask yourselves. And I think that when you look at the context of these things, this is merely being described, not prescribed. There's no evidence that these are things that God is actually condoning and saying, yes, you should do these things. That was a good thing to do. And of course, there are other areas in the Bible that might be disturbing as well. In the Old Testament, for example, an unmarried woman, it seems like an unmarried woman could be compelled to marry her rapist. In other words, if an unmarried woman or even an unbetrothed woman, someone who's not necessarily engaged, is met and accosted and raped by a man, it seems to suggest that the woman has to be compelled to marry her rapist as long as the rapist could pay the standard bride price to the woman's father, and he was okay with the marriage. And of course, that it seems to be found. I know the reference, in other words, is in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 to 19, and in Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 to 17. And the question is that real? Is that true? Is that what the Bible is actually saying? Is it really saying that a woman should be compelled to marry her rapist? And of course, we're going to get in a little bit into Paul's letter, not only in 1 Timothy, but in 1 Corinthians as well, about whether women should be silent in the churches as well. So there's a lot to cover here, but we have to make the objection as real and as substantive as we possibly can, because we need to provide a robust response to that objection. And so the question is, do we have robust responses to the objection? And I think the answer is we do indeed. Now, from a legal perspective, and you've heard me say this numerous times because it bears repeating, and I think most objections can actually be answered when we look to the four corners of the document, when we look at all of the context of the document, not only in terms of the intrinsic evidence within the document, in other words, what does the document say about itself? And you try to harmonize things through statutory construction principles or contract interpretation, or just basically good biblical hermeneutics, which is, hermeneutics is just simply a fancy way to say, how do we interpret the Bible? One of the best ways you can do this is by making sure that any seemingly ambiguous content of a document is interpreted in light of the unambiguous. And you try to make them harmonize whenever possible, because you want to assume that an author or authors, plural, if there's some reason to connect the two, haven't done something intentionally or even inadvertently contradictory. So you take the broadest context possible within the document. So when you're looking at intrinsic evidence, in other words, in the document itself, to determine how a particular area of that document should be interpreted, you look in light of other areas of that document. But then you can also look, in certain circumstances, to extrinsic evidence. And extrinsic evidence is simply evidence outside the document. That this would be historical context, or what was going on in the minds of the people at the time that something was happening in the Bible or whatever it might be, that would give more color and more context to certain phraseology. Now, this is terribly important in our day and age, because what we want to do, the natural inclination, and this is not something that is inherently wrong, it's just something that we do as human beings, is we take our paradigms, our 21st century paradigms, our highly technological, our highly temporally precise and chronologically precise paradigms, and our very, very different language of English, and try to make interpretations based on that on a very different language in terms of ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek or Aramaic, and say, we're going to use our standards today to interpret language that was thousands and thousands of years old in a completely different historical context. And of course, that wouldn't be fair. You have to understand a document in its context historically and linguistically. Having said that, I think the skeptic would be right to say, hey, wait a minute, though. Aren't you saying the Bible is eternally contemporary? I've said it many times, and I'm quoting Leslie Newbigin, or at least I'm paraphrasing him, that the Bible is, in fact, temporal in terms of its application to the people at the time, but it's also timeless in the sense that we can glean principles from it, from the words of Scripture themselves. And so, yes, it's timely in terms of applying today, but it's also timeless in the sense that it applies in all days. But it's also timely, once again, in the sense that it applies to the context in which it was written. So we have to take that into account. So those are the legal principles we're going to apply when it comes to these texts, these quote-unquote ridiculous Bible verses you've never heard. And many of you have, and if you're a skeptic, my guess is you've probably actually said them out loud. So let's do this. Let's take possibly the most horrendous one from the Old Testament and try to interpret this in terms of its context, not only intrinsically, but possibly extrinsically as well. And that one is this one. It's the one where a woman seems to be forced to marry her rapist in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 to 29, and Exodus chapter 22, verses 16 to 17. Now, I also want to pause here for a moment. I wrote a whole book on these issues. It's called More Than a White Man's Religion, and there's probably going to be a link in the description where you can get a copy of that, where we go into a lot more detail on this and other topics as well, on the Bible's treatment of women. And specifically, not only the texts themselves, but how do you view these things through the lens of the life of Jesus to actually get a strong context. And that reminds me, by the way, is that this is only part one. We're going to have a part two to this series because this is an important topic. And part two will not just respond to the allegations against the Christian faith, but I'll be presenting a positive case. In other words, a case for the way the Bible actually exalts women to their rightful place as equals to men. And biblically speaking, this can be defended. So tune in for part 2, because we're going to get into the meat of the positive then. But this part 1, we're going to respond to the objections. So let's get back to our horrendous texts, or at least the text that the skeptic would call horrendous. Do the texts in Deuteronomy 22 and in Exodus 22 actually say that a woman is compelled to marry her rapist? Here's what it says. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Okay, that's from Deuteronomy. Now, I want to pause for a moment there. When you read that, a quick surface reading would suggest that the woman is now supposed to be married for the rest of her life to the guy who just raped her. But does it actually say that? Let's read it carefully. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, in other words, she's not engaged, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver. So notice something. The obligation is all on the man. The man has to give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver. The woman is not obligated to do anything. There's no obligation on her so far. And she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Now, if there is an agreement here, she can become his wife. Now, what does that actually mean? We're going to get into that in a second. That's not required of the woman. All the requirements so far you've seen are of the man who's done the violating of her. Now, I also want to make sure you hear this point. This is terribly important, okay? Because this text literally says that he has violated her. I also want to be careful here as well, because I think this is referring to forcibly seizing someone. In other words, raping her without her consent. But it doesn't necessarily mean that he has to rape her as well. There can be something of even if there's some level of consent, but he clearly has the authority. He has the power in the dynamic going on here. And so he's abused that power, whether he seduces her or takes her by force. He still has abused that power and actually violated her. And the Bible is specific because it says he has an obligation to her for the rest of her life and the rest of his life. He has an obligation to financially support her. Why? Because he has violated her. That is a stark distinction in Old Testament days to the context of the ancient Near East and the religious codes and even the legal codes of other religious and even non-religious codes in the surrounding areas around the Israelites. The Assyrians and the Babylonians and all these folks, they didn't have this idea that a man was somehow now tied to the woman that he had raped or had seized or seduced in any way, in any real sense of the lasting terms. He could basically buy her and he'd be able to divorce her whenever he wanted to and just, fine. I raped her. I pay the father something because she's the property of the father. But once that's done, no big deal. I can divorce her whenever I feel like it. And the divorce laws in the ancient Near East, in the surrounding areas around the nation of Israel, were atrocious. She could be divorced for any reason. And if she even petitioned for divorce and that petition was found to have a lack of merit, she could be put to death. So a woman wouldn't even try to petition for divorce because she might lose her life in the middle of all that. And even if she is divorced, it's almost like a death sentence anyway, because women in those days did not have the ability, in the main, to support themselves financially. Yes, there are exceptions, but in the main, women did not have the ability to support themselves financially. So if a woman wasn't married and she was outside of her father's house, she was likely going to starve to death, or some other terrible thing would happen. She'd be captured and sold into slavery or whatever it might be. That's the harsh reality within which the Bible is operating. A harsh reality where women simply did not have the opportunities to support themselves that they would have in our current culture or in the past couple of 100 years. It just wasn't there. It just wasn't there. And if a woman was no longer a virgin, the likelihood of her, even if she didn't marry the person who violated her, the likelihood of her ever getting married was almost zero. So once a violation happens, she's basically ruined for life, unless she stays in her father's house. She's ruined for life. That's the context in which the Bible's operating. With religions outside of Hebrew religion, as the Bible teaches it, and the laws in terms of the biblical context, she's basically dead. But within the biblical context, there's actually a safeguard and a protection for a woman who is sort of left violated in this way. So let's look, and of course the passage in Exodus chapter 22 is very similar as well, but it also talks about seduction. It doesn't necessarily talk about rape. But the point is that either in seduction or in rape, a man has obligations to the woman he has done evil to. Now, Exodus chapter 22 is interesting because it gives a little more color and a little more commentary to the spirit of the law intended here. Exodus says, if a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. In other words, the father isn't required to actually give his daughter away. Now, someone might say, but see, that just puts all the power into the father's hands here. But it doesn't necessarily mean that, because what you don't have in any sense of the word, I think, in the Old Testament, is a sense in which the father owns the daughter such that he can drag her off kicking and screaming to marry someone she doesn't want to marry. I don't think there's a law in the Old Testament that requires a woman to marry a man that her father has dictated to her. In other words, the father's consent to the marriage is actually part and parcel of his communication with his daughter and likely his family, where they come and they say, is this a good arrangement for our daughter? And she has a say in the matter. And so it's not the kind of thing that she just gets bought and sold as if she's a commodity because there's a bride price. That's not what the bride price is about. So it's important to see that her consent is at least implied throughout the corpus of the text of the Old Testament and is part and parcel of why the father can say, I'm not giving my daughter to you in any sense of the word. Now, I want to actually pause for a moment here too, because if you've noticed something, the texts never say that she is required to agree to any of this. It also doesn't say that if she's his wife, she's required to live with him. This is important too, because just because she's his wife doesn't mean she has to leave her father's house. She can stay in her community. She doesn't have to go off with this guy and live with him. In other words, they can be married. This is important. Follow me now on this. If a woman is seduced or raped and taken advantage of and violated, as the Bible says she would be in that instance, violated, and that guy pays what he needs to pay, she becomes his wife. But she's not required to actually live with him. But he can never divorce her. Why is that important? Because even though there were polygamous relationships in the Old Testament, the law does not condone polygamy, which means that if he's married to her for the rest of his life and he cannot divorce her, even with cause, he can't divorce her, he can't marry somebody else either. And he's required to financially sustain her for the rest of her life, because in that culture, not by law, but by culture, she's probably never going to get married again. And he is responsible for that. He's the one who did that to her. And so he needs to financially pay for her for the rest of his life. And that's important because it means it dignifies the woman in a very harsh situation. And it also disincentivizes any man to not rape or seduce a woman because he is basically given a financial life sentence to respond and to rectify what he's done. He can never fully rectify what he's done. Obviously, that's the case. Money can't do that. But what it can do is disincentivize bad behavior, but can also try to lessen the damage that's done when someone is treated so brutally and so awfully. So the Bible is not about forcing a woman to marry her rapist. No, it's about forcing the rapist to take care of the woman he violated. So let's now turn to some of the texts of the New Testament and speak to those specifically. And again, we're going to cover two texts: the First Timothy passage that we heard in the opening remarks, but also from 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 33b to 35. So let's start with the 1 Corinthians passage, if we don't mind. And this is what it says. As in all the, and I'm reading from the ESV, by the way. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there is anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. That sounds pretty harsh. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 to 15. Dictate women's complete silence, does it? And how they dress, does it? Let's see. It says, I desire then that in every place the men should pray, lifting holy hands without anger or quarreling. Likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel, with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness, with good works. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. But she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Okay, so those are the texts. Kathy Keller, by the way, who is the wife of Tim Keller, has a book out where she talks about gender roles and the Bible. And she has said that some have referred to these texts as the so-called texts of terror, which sound pretty bad for women, because it says, be submissive to your husband, just be quiet, sit in the corner, sit still, look pretty, that kind of a thing. But does it really teach that? Again, look to the four corners of the document intrinsically to see if this is the proper way to interpret this in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and see if this is what's going on here. Now, I'm going to give a preview a little bit for the second part of this, and you'll see something, is that the Bible has numerous places where it actually describes women as having authority, not just some authority, but divinely appointed authority. In other words, men didn't give the authority to women. God gave the authority to women. The most prominent example I can think of is in the book of Judges, where a woman named Deborah is pronounced a judge over the people of Israel. That's a position of huge authority because there were no kings in the days of the judges. The judges were the highest authority. Then, of course, you have Huldah, who is a prophetess. You have Esther, an entire book named after a woman named Esther. It's interesting, too, because Mordecai is her kinsman, and he figures prominently in the entire book of Esther. But the book of Esther isn't named after him. It's named after her. Esther is like a savior figure, and I think she actually is a sort of type and shadow, sort of a foreshadowing of the Christ who is to come, and a woman is given that honor. And of course, we see in the New Testament, we see Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the wedding of Cana, actually telling people to do whatever it is that Jesus actually says to do. She's exercising authority in that particular context. And those are just a couple of little things here and there that give us the broader context in the scriptures of what's actually going on. Does the Bible require every woman at all times to be submissive, such that teachers have to call it quits and we can't have any women doctors or women presidents or whatever? Because that's what Kyle was suggesting in his opening remarks, that because the Bible has this blanket overall provision that women are never to be in authority, that women can't ever be in authority. And of course, I just pointed out instances where women have tremendous amounts of authority, speaking on God's behalf and judging the people of Israel, acting as foreshadowing of savior figures and all kinds of stuff throughout the text. So he's just wrong on that. He's just wrong. But this also helps to flavor how we can see and properly interpret 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Timothy as well. So let's look again to the intrinsic evidence within the document, to look at the 1 Corinthians 14 passage to see if that actually says this idea that women should be quiet all the time and, sort of adorn themselves respectably and not have any authority in church whatsoever. You look into the four corners of the document, you see that just 3 chapters before 1 Corinthians 14, the text we just read, in chapter 11, Paul says women are to prophesy and pray in church. You understand this is important. Prophecy is itself an authoritative act of speaking on behalf of God himself. So Paul is condoning, I think, and God through Paul, condoning that women are to prophesy. In other words, speak authoritatively. And so Paul can't be saying in 1 Corinthians 14, women can't speak ever and be in total silence, if just 3 chapters before he said women can speak, in fact, authoritatively on behalf of God himself. Paul can't be condemning in chapter 14 what he just got done condoning in chapter 11. Now, of course, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 28, Paul ranked the gift of prophecy as higher than the gift of teaching. So that's important as well. What's going on in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is not about a blanket prohibition of women saying anything in church and just sit still in the corner, wait till you're home, and then ask your husband in this sort of submissive, head bowed, please, sir, can I have an answer to my question kind of a posture. No. What's going on extrinsically is that there is a nascent church just being born in Corinth and in Ephesus, where he's writing in 1 Timothy, and it just wasn't ready yet for a whole lot of things. It needed to be regulated and taken care of. What it needed was trained clergy to help interpret the scriptures, to help with the message. It needed people who were companions of Jesus to be able to take what he did and said and make sure they apply consistently with the nascent community of believers in accordance with what the Bible actually already teaches. So you need a trained clergy. And the reality is that women, unfortunately, at that time, weren't given the broad access to the training that men had. And so what ended up happening was women who were excited about the church, who were excited about the new movement, were entering into the churches in Ephesus and in Corinth, and they were spreading false doctrine, not because they were bad people necessarily, or because they were ignorant people in terms of, when I say ignorant, I don't mean people who did not know, because they clearly did not know because they didn't have the education that men were afforded, but ignorant in the sense of they were haughty people who just sort of forced their views on people, although that was happening as well. What you had was false doctrine creeping into the infant church. And it was because women were succumbing to some false teaching that was provided to them, either in their context in Corinth and in Ephesus, or in broader contexts as well. And if you're going to take care of a church in its very infancy, what you have to do is guard against any false doctrines, because there's no place better to corrupt a growing community than in its cradle. And so what you needed was protection around that cradle. Kathy Keller, once again, points out false doctrine was the biggest enemy of the infant church, and the counter to it was to have a group of local elders chosen for their maturity in the faith, whose job it was to judge truth away from heresy. Okay? The trained clergy at that time were men. That's just the way it was. And so that's the context that's important here as well. Now, someone might say, but wait a minute, hold on. No, you're trying to box it into a certain context of the Corinthian church. But Paul says, doesn't he? As in all the churches of the saints, women should be silent and all these kind of things. So wasn't Paul being general, not specific to Corinth? Well, that's certainly possible. But in the light of the intrinsic evidence that he just said in chapters 11 and 12, that women could prophesy and pray, which are acts of speech, authoritative acts of speech in the terms of prophecy, we can't necessarily think Paul is therefore saying silence, because he just got done saying they can speak. But when you look at as in all the churches of the saints, where does this go? Does that phrase go with 1 Corinthians chapter 14, 33a or 33b? Okay, so responsible scholars link the phrase as in all the churches of the saints, not to 33b, but to 33a. Now, I want to pause, okay, just for a moment. I'm not advocating for that position, nor am I saying it's not the right position. What I am saying is that responsible translators and scholars of the Bible have said that the phrase, as in all the churches of the saints, applies to verse 33a, not necessarily 33b, such that it would read like this: for God is not a God of confusion. That's verse 33a. So it says this: for God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints, period. And then he goes on to talk about women speaking. So it is specific to the Corinthian church, not to all churches. And this is, of course, found in the NASB and in the NIV as well, those translations of the Bible. Why is this important? First, a couple of things. The verses and chapters in the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33, those chapter distinctions and those verse distinctions are relatively new inventions. That's not how the original manuscripts read. They didn't have chapter distinctions. They didn't have verses there. Those conventions were invented later so that you and I could have discussions like this, essentially, where we could pinpoint something specifically within a text. But the originals didn't have it. So it isn't necessarily obvious in this case that, as in all the churches of the saints, should go with the phrase, for God is not a God of confusion, or if it should go with the phrase, and women shouldn't speak and all these kind of things. So it's not obvious from the chapter and verse conventions because there were no chapter and verse conventions back then. So as I said before, responsible Bible translators and scholars have interpreted it differently. Now this would make some sense, this idea that as in all the churches of the saints should go with 33a and not 33b, since Paul clearly, within the same letter to the Corinthians, just a few chapters before, mentions that women should pray and prophesy or speak authoritatively. So the legal principle here is that ambiguity or possible interpretations of something that looks possibly ambiguous can be resolved so that the preferred interpretation of an ambiguous text is one that harmonizes with the non-ambiguous texts. And it's not ambiguous in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 5, by the way, that women are allowed to pray and to prophesy. It's not ambiguous at all. And it's not ambiguous that that's actually verbal. So that's not ambiguous. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33 is at least arguably ambiguous. And so if you were to take those two and apply a legal principle of statutory or contract construction and say this ambiguous text should be interpreted and possibly translated in light of the less ambiguous, then you could reasonably come up with a way to say that this is not a blanket statement for all the churches, but what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 14 is what's going on specifically at the time for the Corinthian church in its nascency, in its infancy. And so it's limited in that context. One could argue that. I'm not saying you have to believe that. What I am saying is at least possible for you to go there. And of course, that could also apply to 1 Timothy. In other words, Timothy was talking about similar such situations where women did not have the training necessary at the time to be able to exposit the word of God, the Old Testament at that time, or interpret things in a scholarly way because they simply did not have the training afforded to them by men at the time. So that's an important distinction as well, that it's very specific to a particular church at a particular time in a particular way. Now, can that be applied to today? That's a big debate within Christianity. There's people called egalitarians, and they believe that women should have every authority and every opportunity to speak at every level as much as men should. That's within conservative, evangelical, or otherwise churches. But there's also a view called complementarianism, where men and women are equal, but men have certain responsibilities and authority to speak. Women have certain authority and responsibility to speak, but not at the same level necessarily. And that's called a complementarian view. Now, I have grossly simplified both of these particular positions. I do recommend going to my book, More Than a White Man's Religion. I have a whole section on this stuff. I do not resolve the egalitarian, complementarian debate within the book. I didn't even try, didn't even intend to. It's been going on for 2,000 years, and I doubt I'm going to solve it anytime soon. But what I have offered you in the case of a response to these objections that the Bible has quote-unquote ridiculous verses is that extremely plausible readings of the texts in their intrinsic context within the document and in the extrinsic context outside the document reveals that these verses are not ridiculous. They're actually ones of care and concern in and around a very hostile environment, but also a critical environment in terms of the birth of the church. So in the Old Testament, women were going to be discarded if they were raped by the outside culture, and God doesn't want that for women. Rather, what he wants is for the person who's responsible for her violation to be responsible for her provision for the rest of their lives. And in the New Testament, you have to take care of the early church so that the women who flocked to the early church could actually benefit from it. So, friends, I'm going to talk about a positive case for the way in which women are actually extolled as equals because of Christ, because of the Bible, in the next episode, which means this. First, make sure you tune in to next time's episode, 2 weeks from now. Second, though, is this. We're going to interact on this material at least twice in deliberations, where Derek Caldwell will join me and we'll have a live discussion with you. Leave your questions in the comments. Go to our social media channels. Send us some questions there. If you have other questions, you can send them to mail, M-A-I-L, at embracethetruth.org. Send them there, and we'll try to address them on the air, live, as it were, as well. But you'll only find out when we're going live, because times will vary a little bit, on the following Tuesday after this episode airs, if you subscribe to this YouTube channel or our podcasts, and then click the bell in YouTube for the notifications. And if you follow us on our social medias, you'll get notified that we're going to go live as well. So if you're listening on podcast, don't worry, there's a way for you to get notified when we're going live. Like I said, typically it's about 1 p.m. Eastern time, but sometimes based on travel, it'll have to vary a little bit. So do subscribe and click the bell. Follow us on our socials so you'll be able to join us live for deliberations. So that's it for today, friends. We'll cover the rest of the issues of positive case next time. But until then, the defense rests.